Have you ever wondered why some people seem to effortlessly attract others while barely trying? It seems completely counterintuitive. You would expect those who work hardest for attention to receive the most. Yet real life often tells a different story. Someone who constantly posts messages and seeks validation may receive polite responses for a while, but the person who shares their thoughts sparingly often captures far more genuine interest. People begin checking their profiles more frequently. They remember their rare comments. They wonder what they're thinking about. They become emotionally invested in hearing their perspective. This is not always because the quiet person is more intelligent or interesting. It is because the human brain reacts very differently to what feels genuine and difficult to decode. One of the strongest reasons people are drawn to those who speak less is the psychology of authentic scarcity. The moment someone's thoughts become selective, the mind often begins assigning them greater importance than they might actually deserve. This pattern appears throughout human communication. When someone shares every detail of their life, people listen but rarely feel compelled to know more. The moment someone becomes selective about what they reveal, curiosity often increases. The person themselves has not changed. Only their approach to sharing has. The same principle quietly influences all relationships. When someone's thoughts are always freely available, the brain quickly adapts to them. They become background noise. But when those insights suddenly become rare, the mind treats them as something that may be missed. Instead of asking, "Do I really find this person interesting?" people often begin asking, "Why aren't they sharing as much as they used to?" That single question can occupy the mind for days or even weeks. The human brain dislikes losing access to something it believes it once understood. If someone who once shared frequent updates suddenly becomes selective, the brain interprets the change as an unfinished story that needs completing. Instead of moving on, many people become even more mentally focused. They check whether the person has posted anything new. They analyze every word of their last shared thought. They search for hidden meanings behind sudden changes in communication style. The less information they receive, the more their imagination begins creating explanations. Ironically, the silence often becomes more mentally engaging than the conversations that came before it. Another reason selectivity creates fascination is because people naturally connect rarity with depth. Imagine reading posts from someone who shares their thoughts every hour throughout the day. Eventually, each insight would lose part of its emotional impact because it becomes expected. Now, imagine hearing profound thoughts from someone who rarely speaks publicly. Those few words suddenly feel much more meaningful. The thoughts themselves may be equally valuable, but their emotional weight changes because they are perceived as carefully chosen. In communication, attention often follows the same psychological pattern. Limited sharing is frequently interpreted as more thoughtful than constant updates. Even when there is no logical reason to believe this, this is why many people become captivated by those who seem to choose their words carefully. They begin assuming that if this person's thoughts are shared rarely, they must be extremely valuable. Their mind quietly creates a narrative. If I can finally understand this person's perspective, it will reveal something profound. At that point, the interest is no longer driven only by the content. It is driven by the desire to access something the brain has labeled as rare and therefore significant. The pursuit becomes emotionally rewarding because every shared thought feels like insight into a valuable mind. However, this is where people often confuse perceived depth with actual substance. Someone may share rarely because they are genuinely thoughtful and selective. But someone else may stay quiet simply because they lack confidence, genuine insights, or authentic engagement. Selectivity alone does not reveal character, yet the brain often overlooks this important distinction. Instead of asking whether the person's thoughts truly add value, many become completely focused on gaining access to those rare insights. The fascination continues not because the communication is meaningful, but because the scarcity itself has become psychologically compelling. Notice how this process quietly changes priorities. At the beginning, someone may have felt only casual interest, but after experiencing selective sharing, their thoughts become increasingly occupied by the same person. They begin investing mental energy into understanding the silence instead of evaluating whether the communication style is actually appealing to them. The more selective the other person appears, the more significant they begin to seem. This is one of the greatest psychological illusions in communication. Scarcity creates perceived value, and perceived value often feels indistinguishable from genuine interest. And it is important to understand that this does not mean staying silent is the secret to becoming fascinating. Artificially withholding thoughts or creating mystery as a strategy is inauthentic, and inauthenticity rarely builds meaningful or lasting connections. The goal is not to manipulate scarcity, but to understand why the human mind reacts so strongly to it. Once you recognize this pattern, you stop confusing mental pursuit with genuine compatibility. You begin asking a better question. Am I interested in this person because they truly offer valuable perspectives, or because my mind is reacting to the fact that their thoughts feel scarce? That single question has the power to break the illusion. It shifts your focus from chasing unavailable insights to understanding your own mental responses. And that is where real clarity begins, because scarcity may start the fascination, but it is unpredictability that keeps people trapped in it long after common sense tells them to focus elsewhere. And once scarcity captures the mind, the next psychological force becomes even more powerful. Mental uncertainty begins turning simple curiosity into lasting preoccupation. Scarcity may spark the initial interest, but it is mental uncertainty that keeps the fascination alive. This is where human psychology becomes even more complex. When people know exactly what someone thinks about topics, their minds eventually settle. They stop questioning every interaction because certainty gives the brain a sense of completion. But when someone's perspectives become unpredictable, insightful one day, silent the next, engaged one moment, and completely unreachable the next, the mind rarely finds peace. Instead, it keeps searching for patterns. That is one of the biggest reasons people become captivated by those who communicate unpredictably. They are not only seeking the person anymore, they are seeking understanding. The human brain is naturally uncomfortable with incomplete patterns. Imagine reading a fascinating article and stopping just before the conclusion. Your mind keeps wondering how the ideas resolve because it dislikes unfinished mental experiences. Communication works in a surprisingly similar way. When someone's thought process remains unclear, the brain treats that uncertainty as an unfinished intellectual puzzle. Every delayed response, every unexpected insight, and every period of silence becomes another missing piece. Instead of moving on, people begin investing more mental energy into solving the mystery. This explains why inconsistent communication often creates stronger mental fixation than complete disengagement. If someone clearly says, "I'm not interested in discussing this," the truth may disappoint, but eventually the mind has something solid to accept. There is closure. But when someone shares deep thoughts one day and disappears the next, curiosity never completely fades. The brain keeps asking, what are they thinking now? What insights are they developing? What caused them to withdraw? These endless possibilities prevent mental closure, making it far more difficult to stop wondering. Notice how quickly uncertainty changes behavior. A person who was once mentally calm suddenly starts checking for updates every few minutes. They replay previous conversations in their head, searching for deeper meanings. They examine communication patterns, wondering why someone shared profound thoughts, but then went silent. Every small action begins carrying exaggerated importance because the mind is desperately trying to reduce uncertainty. The less information it receives, the more theories it creates to explain the silence. One of the strongest psychological forces behind this process is anticipation. The brain releases mental excitement not only when it receives insight, but also while waiting for it. This is why an unexpected message from someone who has been silent can feel far more engaging than 10 predictable updates from someone who shares constantly. The unpredictability itself makes each moment of communication feel mentally significant. Over time, people stop seeking the relationship itself and begin chasing the mental stimulation created by occasional bursts of insight. This is why mixed communication patterns are so powerful. When someone behaves inconsistently, they unintentionally create a mental cycle. A thoughtful message raises curiosity. Silence creates mental tension. Another brief moment of insight brings satisfaction. Then quiet returns again. This repeating pattern keeps thoughts constantly active because the outcome is never certain. The mind becomes focused on predicting the next interaction instead of objectively evaluating whether the communication style is healthy. The fascination continues because uncertainty feeds mental investment. However, there is an important truth many people fail to recognize. Uncertainty does not necessarily mean someone is profound. It simply means their communication pattern is unclear. Yet the human mind often confuses these two completely different things. Instead of asking whether the interaction is built on mutual understanding and consistency, people become obsessed with decoding unpredictable behavior. They mistake confusion for depth and inconsistency for intellectual sophistication. In reality, many meaningful relationships feel peaceful precisely because they do not require endless interpretation. Emotionally mature people understand this difference. They appreciate clarity more than excitement created by confusion. When someone consistently communicates in confusing patterns while offering only occasional insights, they do not automatically assume the person is mysterious or highly intelligent. Instead, they ask whether the interaction provides understanding, respect, and mental stability. If the answer is no, they recognize that uncertainty is controlling their thoughts rather than genuine intellectual compatibility. This awareness protects them from becoming trapped in endless mental pursuit. Another reason uncertainty keeps people fascinated is that the imagination is often more powerful than reality. When information is missing, the mind fills the empty spaces with assumptions. People begin imagining future conversations, future insights, and future revelations that may never actually happen. The less they know, the more freedom their imagination has to create an idealized version of the other person's mind. Eventually, they are no longer pursuing who the person truly is. They are pursuing the version their own thoughts have created. This is why mental uncertainty can become addictive. Every unanswered question creates another reason to stay intellectually attached. Every small sign of insight feels like progress toward finally understanding the situation. Yet, the understanding rarely comes because the cycle depends on unpredictability. As long as certainty remains out of reach, the mental pursuit often continues. Understanding this psychological pattern changes everything. Instead of interpreting uncertainty as proof that someone is intellectually superior, you begin recognizing it as a natural trigger for the human mind. You stop glorifying confusing communication and start valuing intellectual clarity. The strongest connections are not built on constant guessing, but on mutual understanding, consistent insight, and honest exchange of ideas. True intellectual attraction may involve excitement, but lasting connection never depends on confusion. Once you understand that uncertainty keeps the mental chase alive, an even deeper truth begins to emerge. Many people are not actually seeking understanding at all. They are seeking the validation they hope will finally prove their intellectual worth. Once mental uncertainty takes hold, another hidden force begins driving the pursuit, and most people never recognize it. They tell themselves they are seeking wisdom. But in many cases, wisdom is no longer the real objective. What they are actually chasing is intellectual validation. They want the person who seemed intellectually superior to finally engage with them because they believe that moment will prove their own mental worth. This is one of the deepest psychological reasons why people become fascinated by those who communicate selectively. The pursuit stops being about gaining genuine insight and starts becoming an attempt to restore wounded pride, damaged confidence, and a sense of intellectual value. Think about how often someone loses interest the moment the selective communicator finally starts sharing consistently. At first, they spent weeks or even months trying to understand that person's perspective. Every insight felt important. Every response felt like intellectual progress. But once they finally received the consistent communication they wanted, the intense mental excitement began fading. If the goal had truly been understanding, and the feelings would have continued growing through mutual exchange and connection. Instead, the mental intensity disappeared because the real reward was never the insights themselves. The reward was proving to themselves that they were finally smart enough to be intellectually accepted. The human ego struggles with feeling intellectually dismissed because dismissal often feels personal, even when it is not. And instead of thinking this person simply has different interests, the mind quietly translates the experience into something much more painful. It begins asking, what's wrong with my thinking? Why wasn't my perspective valued? What do they find in other conversations that they don't find in mine? These questions create mental discomfort, and the brain immediately looks for a way to remove that discomfort. The easiest solution seems obvious. Earn the intellectual respect of the person who seemed unimpressed. If they finally engage meaningfully with you, then perhaps all those painful questions will disappear. This is where the chase becomes dangerous. Every small sign of intellectual acknowledgement starts feeling like proof that success is getting closer. A thoughtful reply, an insightful question, or a meaningful exchange becomes evidence that the effort is working. Instead of stepping back and asking whether the communication is genuinely enriching, people become emotionally invested in completing a personal mission. Winning the other person's intellectual respect becomes symbolic. It no longer represents learning alone. It represents victory over intellectual rejection. That mental shift explains why some people chase those who consistently ignore their thoughts while overlooking people who genuinely appreciate their perspectives. Notice how strange this pattern can become. Someone who offers consistent insight, respect, and intellectual engagement may receive very little mental excitement in return. Meanwhile, the person who gives Almost no intellectual acknowledgement continues occupying all the mental space. This happens because certainty satisfies the need for understanding while dismissal activates the need for intellectual validation. The ignored person begins believing that if they can just gain respect from the one who withholds it, they will finally feel intellectually complete. Unfortunately, validation gained through endless intellectual pursuit rarely creates lasting confidence because it depends entirely on another person's opinion. Another reason validation becomes so addictive is that the human mind often confuses difficulty with importance. The harder something feels to achieve intellectually, the more valuable it appears. This is why some people become convinced that the understanding they struggle for must represent their deepest intellectual connection. In reality, the intensity they feel is often produced by resistance, not compatibility. They mistake mental effort for mental connection. They assume that because the pursuit is exhausting, the intellectual reward must be extraordinary. But struggle alone does not prove that something is right for your mind. Intellectually mature people eventually recognize this illusion. They understand that being intellectually accepted by someone who repeatedly dismisses them cannot repair insecurities that already exist within them. External intellectual approval provides temporary relief, but it does not create lasting intellectual self-worth. If your confidence depends entirely on whether one specific person validates your thinking, then another dismissal will eventually create the same mental pain all over again. Real intellectual confidence grows when your mental value is no longer determined by someone else's willingness to engage with your thoughts. There is another psychological reason people chase intellectual validation instead of understanding. Dismissal creates an unfinished mental story. Many people cannot accept that not every intellectual connection is meant to happen. So they continue trying to rewrite the ending. They imagine that if they just express ideas more clearly, become more knowledgeable, or wait long enough, everything will finally work out intellectually. Their focus shifts away from understanding the other person's genuine interests and toward proving that they deserve a different intellectual outcome. They stop asking whether the exchange is mutual and start asking how they can finally earn the intellectual approval they believe they need. This mindset quietly traps people for months or even years. They postpone connecting with people who genuinely appreciate their thoughts because they remain mentally attached to someone who never consistently valued their perspective in the first place. They sacrifice intellectual peace for intellectual possibility. They sacrifice clarity for hope. The pursuit continues not because understanding keeps growing, but because the need for intellectual validation keeps demanding another chance. Understanding this changes the way you see intellectual relationships. You begin separating genuine curiosity from wounded pride. You stop assuming that mental intensity automatically means intellectual compatibility. Instead of asking, why don't they value my thoughts? You begin asking, why am I giving so much mental power to someone who has shown so little interest in genuine intellectual exchange? That single question shifts your attention away from earning intellectual approval and toward protecting your own mental well-being. The truth is that people often chase those who ignore them intellectually because they believe being intellectually chosen by that person will finally prove their mental worth. But genuine understanding never requires you to earn your intellectual value through endless pursuit. The healthiest intellectual relationships begin when two people freely recognize each other's mental value without forcing either person to fight for basic intellectual attention or respect. And once you understand that the chase is often driven by intellectual validation rather than understanding, the next lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The people who are sought most intellectually are not those who play mental games. They are those whose intellectual self-respect quietly makes their insights feel genuinely valuable. Once people understand that intellectual validation plays a major role in mental fascination, they often make a serious mistake. They conclude that the solution is simple: ignore everyone's ideas, act intellectually superior, and become mentally unavailable. They believe that if intellectual distance makes people chase, then the more aloof they become, the more intellectually attractive they will appear. This misunderstanding has created countless unhealthy intellectual dynamics. The truth is far more complex. People do not continue chasing someone simply because they ignore intellectual input. They chase those whose intellectual engagement appears valuable. And true intellectual value is created by mental self-respect, intellectual honesty, and meaningful insight, not by calculated intellectual indifference. That is why people chase those who seem intellectually selective only when that selectivity reflects genuine intellectual confidence rather than manipulation. Think about two different people. The first deliberately ignores thoughtful questions, disappears from intellectual discussions without explanation, and behaves unpredictably just to make others mentally anxious. At first, this may create intellectual curiosity, but over time, and it usually creates mental frustration, intellectual distrust, and cognitive exhaustion. The second person is thoughtful, insightful, and intellectually present when they choose to engage, but they are not constantly available for every discussion because they have intellectual priorities, personal studies, and healthy mental boundaries. They do not chase intellectual approval, and they do not organize their thinking around receiving mental attention. Which of these two people is more likely to inspire lasting intellectual attraction? Almost always, it is the second. The difference is not the absence of intellectual engagement. The difference is the quality and authenticity behind it. One of the biggest reasons people chase those who seem intellectually independent is that intellectual independence communicates mental self-respect. When someone values their own thoughts, protects their intellectual peace, and refuses to beg for mental validation, they quietly demonstrate that they believe their insights have worth. Human beings naturally notice this. We often assume that people who respect their own thinking have intellectual qualities worth discovering, because confidence without intellectual arrogance signals inner mental security.